So as someone who's made a ton of videos about the UCAT, you'd think I'd have answered most of the questions people have about the test by now. But the one question I keep getting asked again and again is how hard is the real exam in comparison to the company papers and the official practice exams? And that is the question that I'm going to be answering today. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. If you don't know me, my name is Emil and I'm a first year medical student studying at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And on this channel, we help students trying to get into undergraduate medicine in Australia. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. So for reference in this video, I sat the UCAT A and Z in 2020, and what I'll be comparing that to is the practice test A found on the UCAT Consortium's official website, Medify's mock exams, and also Medentry's mock exams. So since it's been about a year since I've sat my test, I have to put this disclaimer out there that things might have easily changed since I sat the test. And because of that, make sure to share your experience doing the test as well in the comments down below, especially if you did the test this year, because it can help other people out a lot. Okay, so now let's get into the actual comparison, and for the majority of this video, I'll be comparing my real testing experience to practice test A on the UCAT Consortium's official website. The reason I'm doing this is because this resource is available to everyone and is free, and I've also done every subtest of practice test A on this channel, so make sure to check out those videos as well. So starting with the verbal reasoning subtest, I personally thought that the VR subsection that I got on actual test day was much harder than what was actually on this practice test. On the other hand though, I did think that the difficulty of the questions on the practice subtest were about similar to what I experienced on actual test day. The big difference in difficulty really just came from the uniform length of the passages, which made it a lot harder to skip and see which passages you wanted to skip. So to put some specific numbers into the comparison, when I did the VR section of practice test day on this channel, I scored 36 out of 44, but on the actual UCAT test, I think I would have scored a little bit lower than that, maybe 32 or 33 out of 44 on the actual VR section of the test. Now moving on to the decision-making subtest, I actually thought that the level of difficulty on practice test A for the decision-making subtest was very similar to what I experienced on test A. I thought that pretty much all the question types were of a pretty similar difficulty to the real test, and I actually remember thinking on test day that the strongest argument questions on the test were significantly easier than what I had practiced. When I did the decision-making subtest on practice test A, I scored 28 out of 29 questions correct, but I think on test day I would have done even better than that, maybe 29 out of 29 correct. With the quantitative reasoning subsection though, I do think that the practice material starts to differ a little bit more from the actual test. I personally thought that the quantitative reasoning section in practice test A was significantly harder than what I experienced on test day. When doing the practice test, I ran into quite a few questions in the quantitative reasoning section that I thought would have been really difficult to do even if I had had more minutes to actually complete those questions. However, on the actual test, I didn't feel that way at all, and I actually felt like all of the questions were very doable. You just needed to know to skip a couple of harder questions at the start, and then you'd be easily able to complete them when you had more time to go back later on. On the QR section of practice test A, I scored 32 out of 36. However, I had a few lucky guesses as well, whereas on the actual test, I feel like I would have scored much higher, maybe 34 or 35 out of 36 without any lucky guesses as well. So now with the abstract reasoning subtest, I also thought again that the practice test A was significantly harder than what I actually experienced on test day. The AR section of the practice test on the official website had, in my opinion, a few questions that I thought were a bit too ridiculous to get, or you needed to see a ridiculous second pattern in order to get 100% accuracy. In comparison to the actual patterns that I got on test day, I felt like I was able to get the majority of the patterns, and there weren't any ones that were really obscure or difficult to do. In addition, I also felt like a lot of the patterns didn't have those secondary rules in order to get 100% accuracy, whereas on practice test A, there were a lot of questions like that. With the subtest that I did live on camera, I scored 46 out of 55 questions correct with a few lucky guesses as well, whereas on the actual test day, I think I would have scored a lot better, maybe 50 or more questions correct out of the 55 on the test. Now, last but not least, I think the situational judgment subtest on official practice test A was very similar to what you get on actual test day. However, on practice test A, I got 63 out of 69 questions correct, whereas on the actual test, I think I would have gotten closer to 55 out of the 69 correct. However, I don't think this difference is because of the difficulty. It's probably more because I might have fluked the one that I did live on camera, or maybe my ethical skills have just increased after I started medical school. Now, I hope from hearing my scores and hearing what I think I might have gotten on the actual test, you can get an idea of how much more difficult or less difficult each subtest might actually be. If you've enjoyed the video so far, do drop a like on the video or subscribe to the channel, as I would really appreciate it. Okay, Okay, so now let's talk about Medify and Medentry's question banks and how they compared to the actual test. Before I start this though, I have to say that it has been more than a year since I used these question banks last, and because of that, the standard of questions could have changed since I last used them. I also unfortunately don't have access to the specific scores that I was getting on these platforms anymore, so I won't be able to make a specific comparison to the real test. Regardless of that, let's start with Medentry and their question bank. With the VR subtest, I actually thought that Medentry very closely matched what I actually experienced on test day, and I thought that their platform was the one that best reflected what the actual UCAT testing experience was like. However, for all of the decision-making, quantitative reasoning, and abstract reasoning subtests on Medentry, I thought that the difficulty of questions was significantly harder than what I actually experienced on test day. I thought that a lot of these subtests from Medentry actually required more complex calculations or difficult thought processes than what was actually required of me on the actual test. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because sometimes practicing with more difficult questions can make you more adept at answering the easier ones. Now, finally, with situational judgment, I thought that Medentry very closely matched what I got on the test day. Now, moving on to Medify and a comparison of their question banks to my actual testing experience, let's start with the verbal reasoning section. In this section, I thought that Medify very closely matched the length of the passages. However, their questions I thought were easier in difficulty. Therefore, when I compare the Medify actual subtest to what I experienced on the actual test, I think that their VR subtest was easier. However, when I compare the other 4 subtests to what I actually experienced on test day, I thought that they all very similarly matched what you actually got on test day. There is definitely a degree of variation in the difficulty of the subtests on Medify, especially with the later ones. However, I actually think that your highest score on Medify should be the one that you consider to be what you might be aiming for on test day, because if you imagine the easiest subtest on Medify, that's pretty much what I thought I experienced on the UCAT Consortium's actual test. Now, even though I've said in this video that one platform might be more closely relating to the test than the other, I don't necessarily think that either one of the platforms is bad, and I think both of them provide a strong enough experience to be perfectly prepared for test day. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you found this video helpful, and check out this playlist to binge all of your UCAT needs.